Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Foundations of Global Health in conjunction with the International Orthopedic Trauma Collaborative. I am Alexa Smith with the Office of International Programs, and we thank you for coming either in person or joining us online via Zoom. All right, that's just a little bit about our series. And this is the last Foundations of Global Health for 2025. A little hard to believe, but our next one will be on Tuesday, January 13th, across the way in HEV 2237. So look out for information on that. And I believe, Dr. Huddy, you're ready with the microphone?
Let's do it, yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much, Alexa.
Of course.
I'll start off with an exciting announcement. First, let me start off with this. Thanks to everyone who came to Cure to volunteer in the warehouse. They're very important partners of ours. We can't do the work that we're trying to do without working with Cure. I was stuck in the operating room. Lori was able to make it, but it sounds like you had a good night. And we want to build that partnership. We have an official ship date. The packing party is going to be on the 20th of January to pack for our shipment going to Zambia. And we're going to take a children's hospital there from 1 operating room to 6 functional operating rooms. So we would love for everybody to be a part of that. So thank you, everybody, for that. That's one announcement. The second announcement is very exciting. I just got an email as I was walking over here that the Internal Revenue Service is officially given 501c3 status to the International Orthopedic Trauma Collaborative. So, which is huge. It took a year and a half to do that, but we need the IOTC. The reason why we need the IOTC, by the way, if anybody wonders, why is there an International Orthopedic Trauma Collaborative? The reason there's an International Orthopedic Trauma Collaborative is because it's just there to handle the unpaid bills of the university. This work is largely a work of the university, but the university cannot buy equipment for hospitals overseas. It can't. So we need an organization that can work with the university where people can give money, get a tax break, and help get equipment for our fellows. It also can't do things, if you can imagine, when somebody comes from Africa, they can't buy a car, but the university can't officially get a car for someone. So things like this, we just need that nonprofit in order to do all the things that we want to do. And if we eventually get to build a hospital, the university can't build a hospital overseas. It can't, but it can work with the IOTC to do that. So it's a huge step in the right direction today. Just makes me so happy. So I didn't know if that was ever going to come. Well, today we're talking about the economic impact of orthopedic trauma. And if there's two kind of like principles I want you to understand or concepts I want you to understand today, one of the things that leads to disparities in delivery of healthcare is what's called value-added commodities. We're going to talk about that a little bit at the end. What are value-added commodities? Value-added commodities, are these things that have contributed to where we're at in medicine today in terms of being able to deliver the care that we deliver. And then the other is a global value chain. We're going to talk a little bit about global value chains and how they affect disparities in healthcare. So, but first, let's just start off with how we get our information in terms of like understanding what's the incidence of certain diseases or injuries, what's the prevalence of certain diseases or injuries. A lot of this data comes from what's called these global burden of disease studies. And this is data that's collected across places over time, and it can help and improve systems for delivering healthcare. For example, this came out of the Global Burden of Disease Study 2021. It identifies a very glaring disparity in delivery of healthcare. What you see here is in red is child deaths in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is the world. And if you look at the world and childhood deaths, over half of all childhood deaths that are occurring in the world are occurring in sub-Saharan Africa, right? This is a glaring disparity. And so what's causing this? So that's the value of a study like this, right? That's not right. If anybody cares about, humanity, this is something we want to impact. Other things that come out of the Global Burden of Disease studies, and this just looks at 2010 to 2021, And what we focus on here, obviously, are injuries, right? We talk about, with respect to the Africa Trauma Initiative, we're focused on injuries. And what is recognized consistently in the global burden of disease studies as the leading cause of injuries is typically road traffic accidents. And if you look from 2010 heading to 2021, road injuries have always been in the top 10. So, and then this is just looking at kind of, it's a different way to look at it. In blue are non-communicable diseases, in red are communicable diseases, and in green are injuries. So you can see the green doesn't take up as much as communicable diseases or non-communicable diseases, but it is substantial. And this just looks at years lived with disability. So, but one thing that I think we need to understand is that the global burden of disease studies and our ability to accurately understand how much injury or how much of a certain disease is occurring, it's not perfect. We're going to touch on that just a little bit. It's substantial. I mean, if you look at here, these numbers on here are very substantial. You can see road injuries make up the largest portion of this. Violence is smaller, but we're going to challenge that just for a little bit. So what are our methods for gathering this information? So let's just take, for instance, WHO estimates on road traffic accidents in Ethiopia. And this comes out of a road safety performance review that came out of the World Health Organization, or it came out of the United Nations. Their estimate for road traffic fatalities in 2016, somewhere between 23,000 to 27,000. But if you look at the Ethiopian police reports, their estimate was 3,000 to 4,000, somewhere in there. So there's a huge difference between those two estimates. And why is that? What that shows you is just that when you go to certain countries, particularly low to middle income countries, their ability to track diseases or injuries is not as good, right? It's not as good. And much of the information we get from global burden of disease studies is the information that these governments give us. It's not completely that. But a lot of it comes from that. The global burden of disease studies in 2019 put road traffic accident mortality at about 16,000 there. So other things that affect these numbers. Let's take conflict-related deaths. And I want you just to think about this. So, and I'm trying to remain as apolitical as possible. But if you just take one African nation for 2021, their conflict-related death estimates, were low. They were, I think they said about 30,000 is what they reported to the global burden of disease studies. But that same African nation had other organizations going, and they, as a result of conflict in that nation, estimated that as many as 800,000 people could have died due to conflict-related deaths. But that wasn't reported in the global burden of disease study. The global burden of disease study that year, that there were estimates of a particular African nation where as many as 800,000 people died, the global burden of disease study put conflict-related deaths throughout the entire world at 96,500 that year. What am I saying? What I'm saying is I think you need to, when you look at these numbers in the global burden of disease studies, you need to understand that there's political factors that influence these numbers. Do you think a country that's in a civil war is going to necessarily give its estimates on how many of its own people are dying? They're not, right? Right. So just have an understanding of that. Much of this data is gathered from national registration systems. In these lower income countries, these systems aren't developed. And also, the World Health Organization will incentivize, and other groups will incentivize certain nations to quantify diseases because they want information on them, and that will kind of build up those numbers. And then certain diseases have social stigma, or certain diseases could affect your employment. Those are going to be underreported. And certain injuries or diseases have a political component, and a country may not want to report those. So just think about that. But what we do know is this: road traffic accidents are increasing. Conflict-related violence seems to be increasing as well. And road traffic injuries are the leading cause of death for children and young adults from age 5 to 29. I just included this just as an illustration of this. This was just me when I was in Egypt with my wife, and we were taking a carriage through this town called Aswan. But this is something that you'll see frequently in Africa. Is a lot of children will come up to cars begging. You see this child's doing pretty well. I mean, obviously he's dressed well, but just watch this. So look at the risk. So, and I've seen this occur on busier streets. And oftentimes these children aren't doing this of their own motivation. Somebody, an adult, has put them up to this to get money for it. Road traffic accidents can cost countries more than their total amount of foreign direct investment that they receive. So it's the cost of road traffic accidents alone is very high. And if the estimates on the higher end of conflict-related trauma are correct, then conflict results in more deaths than road traffic accidents. But it's just this hidden cause of trauma that nobody's talking about, right? And then by the same or in a similar vein, work-related deaths. If you remember one of our first lectures on an overview of the orthopedic or of the African Trauma Initiative, you know, the area in the world with the highest concentration of work-related deaths is Africa. This is something that a video that I just.
Here these women are working right on the highway.
Outside of my hotel that I was staying in, but you can see these women are working alongside the road.
I mean, if you look at this, these are hardworking people. You can see the society just carries.
Developing nations are just a much different type of society. There's a lot of rapid development that's occurring. The governmental systems that look out for the safety of workers are not as well developed as they are in developed nations. And so what you have is you have people working in conditions that just are not as safe. You can see they're working on the side of the road. There's no road signs up. There's no, protective barriers. If you look at injuries also, animal-related violence contributes to actually a fair number of injuries. And you can see, there's packs of dogs here. So when you're trying to wrap your head around why do 90% or more of the injury-related deaths occur in low to middle-income countries, there's so many factors contributing to it. But this is one of the reasons why. Number one, there's more of it, right? There are more injuries there. But then other things that contribute to it is they don't have the systems to necessarily treat it, right? So if we want to, as an American university, impact this trauma epidemic, how can we do it? From this university, how can we do it? And particularly for me, I'm in orthopedics, particularly from the orthopedic department, how can you use the muscle that we have to impact that? Let's look at what we have in terms of this data, in terms of the numbers. Let's look at what we have. When it comes to injuries, what is it? What makes up these injuries? Well, fractures, in terms of severe non-fatal injuries, they account for about 40%. So almost half of all severe non-fatal injuries are fractures. And they also account for about 40% of the years lived with disability. And you can just see this graph here. Here's musculoskeletal injuries. Here's non-musculoskeletal injuries. So this is all injuries. But look how much disability. So this on your right actually is your hospital admission. And then on the left is years lived with disability. But look how much disability is attributed to musculoskeletal injuries. And then if you look at the total fracture burden, what is it we're treating? What are the fractures that are most predominant? The fractures that are most predominant are those from the knee down. And then if you add in the femur, that accounts for about half of all the fracture burden. And those are the ones that carry with them the greatest disability and the greatest risk for mortality, if you take out pelvic fractures. So if the global burden of disease study in 2016 is accurate, musculoskeletal injuries account for about 71.1% of all severe non-fatal injuries. So what that tells us is, if you want to have an impact on the trauma epidemic, addressing orthopedic type injuries is one way to do it. But there's other factors involved in this as well. It's not just the numbers, and numbers affect cost, right? The more you have of something, obviously, the higher the cost goes. If you look at this right here, this is a graph, and it's a graph of a Papua New Guinea's hospital numbers. Here's the total direct medical cost. If you look at fractures, look how high the costs of fractures are. And that cost to the hospital is so high in part because they're treating so many fractures. The red dots are the mean cost per patient. So if you look at the mean cost per patient, fractures are a little bit higher, but actually abdominal injuries rank the highest in terms of cost to the patient, mean cost. But what are the things that produce the highest cost? What do you think the things are that produce the highest cost when it comes to treating a patient? Just poll the audience. Any guess? I wonder if you guys have learned this. What adds the most to a patient's care? I love that guess. That's not it, but I love that. I want to talk about that in the OR. It's not that. It's not that. It's not that. So it's your days in the hospital, particularly days in the critical care unit, or your length of stay. Your length of stay. That's it. So when you'll see it. Wait till you get like into your ward rotations. Boy, and then Dr. Bebe's here in internal medicine. I bet he could talk about how somebody just breathes down his neck about getting patients out of the hospital because length of stay is costly. And when you have a bundled payment, so when somebody says, for everybody that gets a hip fracture, you're getting $20,000. And you have to make the best use of that $20,000. Or if you have to make the best use of that $27, you need to get them in, fix them, and get them out. Because every day they stay in the hospital, that you lose money, right? So your length of stay really matters. And if you look here, critical care unit on here, I don't know if you can read this or not, but it's one. This came out of a study from the National Health System in the UK, but $1,328 per day in the critical care unit. Surgery for a fracture is $1,597, but that's a one-time cost, right? But every day you're almost paying the cost for a surgery. Every day they're in the ICU. A craniotomy, where is that down here? Craniotomy is $1,906. So yeah, fracture surgery, craniotomy is about the same, but the critical care time, really expensive. And then the time on the floor, that adds up as well. So those are your biggest drivers of cost. Here just shows the various regions of the body, also came out of that UK study and the costs associated with them. And this was based, and then up top, you've got your injury severity score. But you can see that a lot of these abdominal surgery, spine surgery, upper limb surgery, all these surgeries are roughly about the same. They're roughly about the same. But when you think of those surgeries, you should think of them as a one-time or maybe two-time cost. So length of stay really matters. This is just a graph also showing American data. It's the same. It's about the same. What drives cost? Length of stay, particularly ICU time, okay? So there's a place I'm going with this. There's a reason we're talking about it. Well, what do we get for what we pay? Right? What do we get for what we pay, and what happens if we don't pay? So take, for example, you have somebody who's got a traumatic brain injury. They require some type of craniotomy or something. What are we getting for that? It's expensive surgery, obviously. Typically, significant amount of time spent in critical care, and then a lot of time rehabbing. And so for that, what do you get? And these are some graphs that just show what the deficits are after somebody sustained a significant traumatic brain injury. About 50% will have issues with balance. Motricity is the ability to perform coordinated muscular movements. About 40% have issues with that. If you look at cognitive and behavioral disturbances, almost 70% have issues with memory or slowness. So I'm just saying, where we're at in medicine right now, when we treat people with traumatic brain injuries, it requires a substantial amount of resources, and still many of those patients end up with some type of functional deficit. What about spinal cord injury? And this can fall in the realm of orthopedics or neurosurgery. Both orthopedic surgeons treat spine injuries as well as neurosurgeons. The difference is, orthopedic surgeons don't go intradural, they stay extradural. But traumatic spinal cord injury recovery depends largely on the injury itself. It doesn't matter where you're treated. If you are a complete spinal cord injury patient, in terms of where you're at, it doesn't necessarily affect your outcome, if you can imagine, because if you've got a severed spinal cord, we don't have a way to fix that, right? We have a way to stabilize your spine. That technology is there, but you're going to, more likely than not, if you came in paralyzed, you're going to leave paralyzed. You may improve somewhat, but you're not going to improve completely, right? So the majority of patients, and if you see that here, I just quote some numbers in a 10.3-year follow-up, 67% of patients showed no improvement. Only 6.8% of patients showed a complete improvement. So burns, another type of injury. Burn, if hopefully some of you guys will get to spend time on our burn unit. It's very rewarding work, but you'll know these patients, a lot of them can spend a significant amount of time in the ICU. It's not quick. A fair amount can die. 70% of patients with burns in a 2-year follow-up had significant functional and psychological impairment. A lot of them will have joint contractures or issues with function. So the point I'm trying to make is, for significant cost, we still end up with disability, and the hospital stay can be fairly long for these patients. But now I'm going to talk about orthopedics. And full disclosure, you guys know I'm an orthopedic surgeon, and I really like orthopedics. So just please accept that. And feel free to criticize me, by the way. If there's a budding neurosurgeon out here, I'm willing to take your criticism, but I want to give you some data. Because what I've done is I've just taken time to list various orthopedic injuries, okay? I'm laying out all these clavicle fractures, scapular fractures, humeral shaft fractures, distal humerus fractures, fractures about the elbow, forearm fractures, distal radius fractures. On this page, look at how they do. Good functional outcomes, 86%, 82 to 93% of the time. Proximal humerus fractures, 95% return to work. Humeral shaft fractures, 86% return to previous employment by 6 months. Distal humerus fractures, 84 to 100%. This is what you see, right? This is what you see. And the same thing if you go to the lower extremity fractures, acetabular fractures, pelvic fractures, femoral neck fractures, intertrochanteric hip fractures. Just take those right there, intertrochanteric hip fractures. At 1 year, 95% minimal to no pain. Subtrochanteric femur fractures, 90% or more achieve pre-injury function. What do you think the mortality rate of somebody with a femur fracture treated non-operatively is? It's closed. 87%, about, right here, 87%. But if you treat them, that patient, you can get in and get out, a healthy patient, probably within 1 to 2 days. You have a low hospital stay, you prevented a death, and they're going to go back to work and support their family. Do you see what I'm getting at with this? If we have a limited amount of resources and you have to spend that somewhere, it's very utilitarian view. I'm not saying it's the right way to think about it, but I'm just saying, because we're talking about economics, which is a utilitarian thing, right? And you'll see where I'm going with this at the end of the discussion. So please don't think I'm a utilitarian. But you're getting good bang for your buck, okay? All I'm saying is you're getting good bang for your buck with orthopedics. And I continue on. I just keep talking about tibial plateau fractures. Orthopedics yields good results. But what happens if you don't treat it? And I mentioned this when we talked about femur fractures, is death can result. Disability can result. Loss of your employment. Inability to support your family. And of course, depression. And instead of being somebody who you could have dependence and support, you now are a dependent, right? So I'm not going to play this because I'm having issues with it. Oh, it plays. Okay. This is
This is
Abbott
the
Hospital.
whole patient or ortho patient?
Yeah.
This is your orthopedic.
Yeah, orthopedic patient.
Dr. Solomon, one of our first fellows,
Yeah.
he's in his ER.
All these people are waiting for surgery.
Yeah, waiting for surgery. You can talk.
And they're all,
Yeah,
these are all like
all
femur fractures.
femur fracture, pilum fracture,
fractures.
pelvic fracture, every fracture.
How long,
Every,
how
huh?
long have they been here? Some of them.
more than 20 days, 20, 30 days.
than
We
20
can
days.
ask them. ለስንት ጊዜ ነው የቆያችሁት እዚህ እናንተ? ለስንት ጊዜ ቆይታችኋል ሆስፒታል ውስጥ? For how long they keep here? ለስንት ጊዜ ቆይታችኋል?
ለምሳሌ አንድ ሰው እኔ 15ኛ
15 days? 5 days? ሌላስ? 4 days? 22 days?
22 days.
Yeah. This one, a surgeon came from America, so he wants to see something. ከአሜሪካ ነው የመጡት።
How long have they been there? The next time somebody complains about a 9-hour wait in the emergency department too, you can just reference this. But I mean, seriously, do you see how when you have an inefficient system that doesn't have much resources, you can just drive, this is incredibly costly to these patients and to the system, right?
አንዳንድ ነገር ማየት ፈልገው ነው እንትን ለማለት
22 days, what does he have?
ምንድን ነው ስብራቱ? ሜቢ ራዲያል ነርቭ ፍራክቸር።
Okay.
ኦኬ ከ22 ቀን በላይ አለ እዚህ ላይ ከ22 ቀን ሞር ዛን 22 days 15 days ሞር ዛን እሺ 2 months he came for checkup.
That's my favorite part. He's been here 2 months. He came for a checkup. I mean, it's just, anyway, that it makes the point, right? There's clearly a problem with, and this was all orthopedic. There's a few neurosurgical cases in there, but this is our trauma hospital. And you can see what overwhelmed that ER. It was orthopedics, right? So, so I want to talk to you about what the economic forces are that are influencing this disparity of care, okay? And one of the things that you guys have told me and have been very good about it as I've given these lectures is, what can I do? Or asking for a call to action. So I've tried to do that, and you can give me your feedback on what you think about it at the end of this lecture. But we need to understand what a value-added commodity is and what a global value chain is, okay? So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And I want to, for example of this, we're going to talk about a fracture and a metal. So there's so much involved in this, but we're just going to, part of understanding this disparity in the delivery of healthcare with respect to trauma is just, you can understand if we just talk about a fracture and a metal. So the fracture we're going to talk about is a fracture of the distal femur here, all right? So right down here, up here's the diaphysis of the femur. Here's the subtrochanteric region. We're going to talk about just this area right here, the distal femur, okay? Now, again, the mortality rate of this, if it's closed, it's about 87%. The way it was initially treated, you can go back thousands of years, 3,000, 4,000 years back. The Egyptians would talk about taking reeds and, putting them around the leg and then binding the leg tight, to try and stabilize it. Obviously, that didn't work too well. If this is closed, it results in an 87% mortality. If it's an open fracture, it's almost assured death, 3 in the 90% range. And then we're going to talk about why this metal matters when it comes to treating this fracture. So in about the 1300s, this guy by the name of Guy de Chaluc, Parisian surgeon, I don't even know if I'm saying that right, but he came up with what's called isotonic traction. One problem with femur fractures is the fact that the musculature around the femur, the thighs, the adductors, the hamstrings, they're so powerful. When that fracture occurs, it shortens and rotates and angulates the limb, right? And so can a cast maintain length? Right? Can you put, a cast is basically a cylinder. So if you wrap a cylinder around something that's short, does that maintain length? Doesn't work, right? It doesn't work. And the other thing is, when you have such a huge soft tissue envelope around a bone, what do you think your ability with the cast is to straighten that out? Not very good. So you got a large soft tissue envelope, strong muscular forces. you really can't control that well in a cast. But this guy came up with this idea of, wait, it's short. If I just pull on it, I could probably help stabilize it and bring it out to length. So he came up with this isotonic traction, and it worked. Here he is, somebody, commissioned a painting of him treating a pope. He was a very, very popular surgeon. And then here's an American Civil War soldier, and he's got isotonic traction. It's a skin traction. It was applied like this. Here, they'd put a plaster cast on, then they'd put on a stirrup, and they'd apply weight to it. So from the 1300s to around the Civil War, this is what they were doing. And then around World War I, they came up with skeletal traction. After the discovery of antiseptic technique, they were able to put pins in bones, and they were able to control them better. And if you applied this type of traction, you would take somebody's mortality from about 87% down to just 20% now. So just stabilizing a fracture, that's it. You can drop somebody's mortality rate that far. So why am I going through this? Well, if this is the method of treatment, how expensive do you think that is? Not too expensive, right? You need a pin. Almost anybody can come up with this. In fact, a lot of people still use that in low to middle income countries for treating femur fractures. That's how they treat their femur fractures. But what's the problem with this? Here's the problem. This is an American surgical ward in World War II. You can see all the American soldiers in skeletal traction. Here's the problem. Bed rest for 8 to 10 weeks. And then if you have suitable signs of healing, you can get up and start to mobilize. How stiff do you think you are after 8 to 10 weeks in bed? Who here would tolerate 8 to 10 weeks in bed? Right? You had no choice. But that's one problem. So you get what's called fracture disease. And fracture disease is your muscles get weak, they get stiff, your joints get stiff, your bone overall gets weak from disuse osteopenia. You get fracture disease from being just down so long. And so you end up with it's not as bad as if you were treating a cast, but you still, if you look at this x-ray, the leg's in valgus, and then look at this deformity here, right? Some things people don't understand about fractures. Femur fractures heal. This is a great example of it. These two were hardly even in the ballpark, and they healed. We didn't start fixing these fractures because they didn't heal. They healed. If the patient survived, it healed. The problem was it healed in a bad position. And then the time it took to heal, by the time it healed, their leg was so stiff and weak, they couldn't really use it. So how do we overcome this? Well, with the advent of sterile technique and surgery, somebody said, man, I know what to do. I want to put a plate in there, right? So they came up with these devices to fix the femur with. And our metals weren't as good. And you have to, when it comes to putting metal in the body, by the way, you can't just pick any metal. There needs to be a lot of thought put into that, right? Don't put, I'm sure when you guys do your allergy section, right, nickel's bad, right? A lot of people have allergies to nickel. So people would use stainless steel. And then they would come up with, because the mechanical forces in the femur are so great, they would come up with these fixed angle constructs. This is called a 95-degree blade plate. And you would chisel out a hole in the bone, and then you'd pound that plate into the side of the bone. And then you'd fix the femur with that, these distal femur fractures. But you can see one problem is oftentimes this would fail. It would just fail. The stainless steel would fail. And there were these things we didn't understand. But as time went on, and in fact, when this failed, this is me, right? I've been around this long. I did this in my practice. This was on my boards. But this is what I did. I revised it to another one of these. And I put in bone graft, and you got it to heal because you could get this to work, and this was better than traction. But it wasn't the best. It wasn't the best. What we found out was, if you look, the red line is stainless steel, the blue line is titanium. So if you have no risk factors, a healthy patient with a distal femur fracture, and you fix them with a titanium plate, your risk of a non-union is about 4%. With the stainless steel plate, your risk of non-union is about 20%. Why is that? Because when you have a broken bone, to some degree, the body has to sense that there's a broken bone there. So you got to have a little bit of motion at the fracture site. That's an interesting thing. Titanium has a modulus of elasticity, which is a measurement of a substance's stiffness. It has a modulus of elasticity that's more similar to bone. So it gives and bends a little bit. If you fix a fracture such that it's so rigid and you don't necessarily put the ends together that the body thinks it doesn't have to do anything, the body will not do anything. It's called an oligotrophic non-union. It's got to feel some stress. Bone's like a muscle. You know, you apply load to a muscle, it gets thicker, denser, and stronger. If you're not using a muscle, it gets weak. So you won't build bone unless you stress it to some degree. So people started coming up with titanium plates that could be used in this area. And here's just an example. Here's a femur fracture, distal region, fixed with the stainless steel plate. It didn't heal. It collapsed into varus. It was revised. This is one of my patients, revised to a titanium plate. Look at this bone. See how much bone it's making on the other side, right? And remember, this was the final healed product. This right here is just, you know, like 2-3 months into healing. You see the difference between titanium and stainless steel? It's huge. So, but where does titanium come from? What is titanium? A lustrous silver-colored transition metal, named after the Titans of Greek mythology. It's the 9th most abundant metal on Earth. I didn't realize this. If you read about this, they said it's found in, to some degree, almost every grain of sand. As I mentioned, it has a modulus of elasticity more similar to bone. It's biocompatible, but it's costly to obtain. Where does it come from? This is just a mineral production by country. So this isn't speaking to where the stores of titanium are at. It's just speaking to where it's produced, right? The biggest stores, you can check me on this, but what I can find is the biggest stores are in Australia, and it makes sense. I mean, I haven't been there before, but there's a lot of sand in Australia. And so you have these certain types of sands that really are rich in titanium. But some of the largest stores in the world are also in Mozambique, South Africa, Madagascar, also Kenya and Sierra Leone. And if you look at the total production of titanium in Africa, it's more than everywhere else in the world. It's more, if you put all of Asia together, Africa still produces for the world more titanium. It does. And it has huge stores there. But how do you get it? Now we're going to get into a value-added commodity, because what we're doing is we're moving from sand on a beach, if you will, to a very expensive implant that you put in to save somebody's life, if you think about it, right? How do you do that? Make sure I'm not running over all the time. Okay, so you got to take this. Now, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a metallurgist, so don't judge me too harshly on this. I've done my reading on this just to get to this point on why there's this disparity in healthcare, right? So you go from sand on a beach, if you will, a coastal deposit, and you have to separate it by gravity. And then after that, you have to magnetically separate it. And then that gives you these non-magnetics. And then they go through a different process. The non-magnetics, the magnetics go through another process. And it ends up with these two things. This is what you need: rutile and limite. Now, how expensive do you think rutile and limite are? They're more expensive than the sand on the beach. But are they as expensive as the implant that you put in the limb? It's not even close, right? It's not even close. If you then want to take that rutile or limite and then turn it into ingot, which ingot is just like it's like a slab of pure titanium. It has to go through this very complicated process called the Kroll process that involves chlorination. And it has to be done in this environment where it's completely surrounded by like argon gas or something. It is incredibly complicated. I have a video I can send anybody who wants to watch it, or you can just search it. But it takes Once you get to the chlorination process, there's few countries that do that. Like America, China, Russia, Japan. It takes very sophisticated machinery to do this. So that part of the process done in nations that are much more wealthy, have much better educational systems. Look at, if you go from, so if you look at, what is this? According to the International Titanium Association, the price of titanium ingots increases the following for each type of product. So when you go from the ingot, by the way, so this process, keep in mind, isn't even done in these low to middle income countries, but just when you go from the ingot, medical components, the price of that ingot is increased up to 10,000 times. This is a value-added commodity. So Madagascar has, on their beach, titanium-rich sand. But by the time we ship it back to them, it's something they can't even begin to afford. Does that make sense to you? And so that's how we get to this. This is the economics of orthopedic trauma, because, and the economics of medicine in general, so much of what makes medicine occur are these value-added commodities. I just gave you an example of it in orthopedics, but it occurs all over medicine. And this just is a little bit on the global value chain. I talked about this, but the global value chain is, it just shows these various stages of production. Titanium minerals on the beach, titanium slag, which you saw occurs after the chlorination process. No, I'm sorry, titanium slag is the rutile and the limeate. Then you've got the chlorinations, the titanium sponge, the melted products, and then the powder products in part. This powder they'll use for like 3D printing and things like that. So, but lower middle income nations are only involved in these stages. That's it. That's it. So if a nation really wants to capitalize on its natural resources, they need to move up the global value chain. And if they could do that, they could diversify their economy. And if they could diversify their economy, they could increase the value of their currency. And if they could increase the value of their currency, they could then enter the global market and be able to afford some of these things. Now, that's a huge problem that we can't solve, right? But it helps you understand why it's occurring. So who owns the mines? Well, this mine in Mozambique is owned by a Dublin company called Kinmare Resources. And if you look, this is just from their managing director. He says, our purpose of transforming resources into opportunity for all is a promise we live every day. It guides how we operate, how we work, communities, how we create value for everyone we touch. That's this Dublin company. And they have associated with them a 501c3 that does humanitarian work. And this is a health center that Kinmare Resources paid for in Mozambique. Now I mean, if you look at, I put up here the shareholder returns. Since 2019, they've returned 300 million to shareholders. So I think we could ask them to make a little bit bigger health facility. So anyway, you'll see where I'm going with this. So in Madagascar, who owns the mine? Rio Tinto owns the mine, and they also have a charitable arm. And you know, one thing they talk about is what they've done to help out the people of Madagascar, and it's true, they have. You know, they have this huge mining operation in Madagascar. Well, if you know anything about Madagascar, and if you got to meet Dr. Fabrice or Francis while they were here, Madagascar doesn't even have running water, right? So if you're a mining company and you're going in, you know, to get the resources out, you need power. And so, well, they put in this huge solar powered plant. They put in lots of roads, right? They put in this bay, and they've invested 1 billion in Madagascar since 2005. So mining is huge. It makes lots of money. And I want to take these companies at their face value. When they say they want to help people, I believe that. And so here's what I think. Here's what I think. And I talked to Francis today and Dr. Fabrice both about this project. And I was talking with him yesterday too. Francis actually takes his island reach to this area to serve the medical needs of these people. And Rio Tinto actually would send their patients to Dr. Fabrice's hospital for care. Because when somebody gets hurt there, I mean, they need to be treated right away. So I will put this invitation out there for anybody who's interested. We're going to approach Rio Tinto for a grant to help build the healthcare resources in and around their mine. And so it's worth, but you know, this is one of the things you guys have asked me when I've done these lectures. It's like, how can I make a difference? And this is one way I think you can. So anyway, I'll just throw that out there. And let's see how much time we have. And we have 10 minutes left, and so I can leave it open for questions. Any thoughts, questions? Did Francis make it on, Alexa? Okay. Okay. Dr. Fabrice? Okay. Well, I knew he was busy today. So, okay. Any questions, comments? I know, yeah. Yeah, it's really a tibia fracture. Oh, yeah, what a great question. It's resources. They don't have enough operating rooms. So because they don't have enough operating rooms, they don't have enough equipment, they just can't get people in. And so what determines your ability to get into the operating room is your acuity. So if you come in and you have a life-threatening injury, you'll get in the operating room right away. But here's what's bad about that. So the people with the most life-threatening injuries are the ones that have the worst outcomes and take the most resources. So those people who jump to the front of the line, they take a lot of resources, and then they leave with the most disability. And then the people that have the more minor injuries, like say a closed femur fracture, don't make it in. They sit there and wait, but what's their mortality rate? So now you take something that you could have treated within 24 to 48 hours and they could have done great, and you turn it into something where now they're dying. You see how just a horrible, it's just this crazy, mess that just occurs. So there's so much that has to be adjusted here. But if you can just get people educated, equipped, and get them the resources, they could kind of make this thing work a lot more efficiently. Yeah.
So going kind of piggybacking off of the last question, do you know if there is any data or literature on like this decision-making process for like what compels people to stay like in the clinics or like, because I'm seeing like, I'm thinking that this would be like a perfect place to do some like qualitative research or like a quality improvement project.
Victor, baby, you probably could. Why do people stay in the hospital? Why will they wait that long?
Like what's the
you're talking about situation in Ethiopia, or are you talking about the situation in Ethiopia?
Yeah.
I think there are multiple layers to this question. One, being safe in the hospital, because when you are in the hospital, you are in the care of a physician, nurses, and even in the US, I remember there were times where patients stay, once they are in the hospital, they stay long. It's more about feeling safe and being able to be here. The other big piece is you'll be provided with food. And for some time, you're not under the stress of your own social situation. And the other issue when you are in a developing country is the sickness role, because if you stay longer, people believe that you're not contributing to society because of the illness that you've gotten. And once you come out, hey, you see, I've been in the hospital for 2 weeks. Believe it or not, this exists. But if you only want to pin down one factor, it's probably because of feeling safe in the hospital. They just want to be around physicians and nurses that can take care of them.
Are you able to? What was the next question? It's huge. The centerpiece of what we do here is education, right? And that's different physicians, because you cannot make anything happen without that. It's really getting, you have, when you're in a country like, Ethiopia, where you saw that emergency department, Dr. Beza said, and if he can, or he can tell you, but is that he didn't realize that you could achieve certain, even the equipment to do it. So you're right, education, you cannot do it without education. Number one, it's just number one.
For the titanium. Like, if I think there is a lot.
Had to pay, I think, people of this Bay Area because fish dying from waste products that were leaking into the ocean around Rio Tinto. There's an environmental impact. Yeah, if you think about it, who in America wants a big mine next to their beach? There's so much about this, but one is there's an environmental impact. Two is I think it's just the richness of the sand. It's in just about everything, but Russia doesn't have like sufficient like deposits of titanium to meet its needs. Ukraine does, but so though you can find it in about everything, it's a very expensive process. So you want to get like sand that is rich in it, I guess. Yeah, again, feel free to check me on that. But yeah. Thank you guys for coming. Give me your feedback. If you want to be involved in this, let me know. Dr. Fabrus said, and Francis, they love this idea. So we can put together just a little committee that can think through this and strategize on how to present this to Rio Tinto. So, and their charitable arm. Thank you guys. We're official. The IRS recognizes us.